This is a version of a lecture that I gave at the AGC Conventicle. I believe that was videotaped as well, so please don't compare the two of them, because they're going to be totally different, because I just work from my notes. But I want to today cover a couple of key issues regarding the Eucharist, and I want to break it up into a couple of different sections. First of all, just sort of discuss some terms, look at the history, look at some of the theology of the Eucharist that we've got up here, its practice, and its esoteric significance. So I actually want to start with a quote from, of all people, not to feed the rumors, but a quote from Aleister Crowley, of all people. And he says, "One of the simplest and most complete of magic ceremonies is the Eucharist. It consists in taking common things, transmuting them into things divine, and consuming them." And he's really hit the heart of what the Eucharist is. The word Eucharistos is a thanksgiving, and it is traditionally a sacrificial offering of the bread and wine. And the reason that I emphasize this sacrificial terminology is that within the sacramental tradition, within the apostolic tradition, we have a priesthood. And the reason that we have a priesthood, the reason that we don't have simply elders or ministers or pastors or rabbis, teachers, why we have a priesthood, and specifically a priesthood, is because in the Eucharist we offer sacrifice. That is what a priest does. When we look at the priesthood through any tradition, whether we're talking about the pagan priesthood in Rome and in Greece, whether we're talking about the Hebrew priesthood, the mission of, the role of the priest is to offer sacrifice. Why do the Jews no longer have a priesthood? Because they no longer offer sacrifice. They now have rabbis, they have teachers. So the fact that we still possess a priesthood is important, because in the offering of bread and wine, we make sacrifice, we offer sacrifice, and we give thanksgiving. This has been a practice within the church from its earliest days. In fact, it was considered to be one of the three central mysteries of the church. Three central mysteries of the early church were the Eucharist, the Incarnation, and the Trinity. That is the heart of what it meant for about 1,000 years to be a Christian. It was rooted in this particular practice, in the theology of the Incarnation, and the principle of the Trinity. Early on, terms like the agape feast, things like the sacred meal, are all used interchangeably with the Eucharist. So occasionally, if you're reading older church documents, you will, even as far back as Irenaeus, you'll start to see these references, and these references are all coterminous with the Eucharist. Now, I've mentioned that the Eucharist is part of Christian practice from its earliest days. And this is attested to by Ignatius of Antioch, who is a Johannite in the truest sense of the word. He was a follower of the Apostle John in the 2nd century. And even in those early documents, the Eucharist is mentioned as if it were a given, that this was the centerpiece of Christian worship. There was simply no question about it. So it is part of Christian worship in its ancient and in its most primitive form. In contemporary churches, the practice of the Eucharist has changed considerably. In fact, most Christian churches no longer possess a priesthood, because they no longer consider the sacrifice of the Eucharist to be the centerpiece of worship. And there are significant differences even among those churches that do offer something like a Eucharist, even if it doesn't fit the the qualifications that are offered by, for example, Catholic or Orthodox theologians. We see a great variety of the matter of the Eucharist, leavened and unleavened bread. I've been showing off the priest's hosts that are water and flour. These ones I don't think even have salt in them. And it's just water and flour. So it's absolutely unleavened. In the Orthodox communion, you'll of course see the big loaf of bread, which they call the lamb. So it's leavened bread. For the wine, we see fermented wine most often. We also see mustum, which is an unfermented grape juice that it's been stopped prior to its fermentation. You also see in many contemporary churches the use of simply pasteurized grape juice. What distinguishes most churches on the most basic level regarding the practice of the Eucharist are the theological interpretations of what actually happens in the commemorative act of offering bread and wine. And it is a commemorative act. No matter what else we say it is always a commemorative act. It is always a memorial of the Last Supper. It always harkens back to that, which is why we use the words of institution to designate the moment of transformation. We'll come back to this. But there are primarily 4 different theological takes on what happens during the Eucharist, what happens to the bread and wine during the Eucharist, all of which fall under the category of the real presence. So this is a generic term that we use for describing what happens in the Eucharist, that the body and blood of God are truly present, are really present in the bread and wine. What exactly that means, though, is going to vary widely from church to church. The earliest form of real presence is what we call transubstantiation. And this is the theological position of the Catholic and the Orthodox churches, which says that the bread and wine, though appearing still to retain their outward form, are truly transformed in both essence and accident into the body and blood of Christ. They become the body and blood of Christ in an absolute sort of way. They are transformed. The substance was one thing, and it becomes another thing. And this is difficult for a lot of people to swallow. This seems like a kind of magical act. This is a kind of hocus pocus that the priest is doing at the high altar, where he suddenly invokes these powers and these words, and bread and wine turn into something else. And this is kind of difficult to handle. This is an extraordinarily sophisticated kind of claim. But it's not the only form of real presence. Another is Sacramental Union, which is the terminology that's used in the Lutheran churches. Sometimes the term consubstantiation is used not by Lutherans. Lutherans will deny that is what's going on. It's almost to the point of it being almost a pejorative term. And sort of like calling a Muslim a Mohammedan. The actual terminology is Sacramental Union. And actually, I'll read you just a quick passage. Martin Luther, in the 1528 Confession Concerning Christ's Supper, says, "Why then should we not much more say in the supper, 'This is my body,' even though bread and body are 2 distinct substances, and the word 'this' indicates the bread. Here too, out of 2 kinds of objects, a union has taken place, which I shall call a sacramental union, because Christ's body and the bread are given to us as a sacrament. This is not a natural or personal union, as is the case with God and Christ. It is also perhaps a different union from that which the dove has with the Holy Spirit. and the flame with the angel. But it is also, assuredly, a sacramental union. So in this, the bread stays bread. It doesn't stop being bread, as in transubstantiation. But the body is also present with it, hence the term transubstantiation. It is considered to be in, with, and under the appearance of the bread and wine. The third one is called the Pneumatic Presence. And we see this in the Calvinist-influenced churches. And the Pneumatic Presence means that it is the body and blood are spiritually present in the bread and wine. But one of the things that's very, very interesting about the Calvinist interpretation of this is that the transformation seems to happen not on the altar, but rather in the act of consumption, in the eating of it. And this is what is really distinguishes the pneumatic presence from other forms of real presence, in that the body and blood sort of permeate the body of the worthy recipient of communion. So the worthy recipient of communion takes the body and blood and is filled with the presence of God. The unworthy recipient is condemned by the consumption of the bread and of the body and blood. It is an act of condemnation. So it's almost as if it turns into poison in the mouth of the unworthy recipient. I'm sorry, what?
You love those Calvinists.
Yeah, I mean, it's an extraordinary kind of dichotomy there. Interestingly enough, this dichotomy is present in other forms of real presence, even within the Orthodox tradition of transubstantiation, where in the Orthodox tradition it is prayed that when we receive communion, that we receive it not for judgment or condemnation. So you in effect make a little confession before you receive communion, so that it might not be for condemnation. Because to receive the Eucharist in a state of mortal sin, to use the Catholic terminology, or to be out of a state of grace, is to eat corruption, to eat condemnation. The last is dynamic memorialism. And I'm excluding from this what is sometimes simply referred to as memorialism, which is not a form of real presence. Dynamic memorialism acknowledges that in the commemoration of the Last Supper, a transformative act takes place, that there is a presence of the body and blood of God in the Eucharist in our memory of this act. Simple memorialism is simply saying it's just bread and wine, and it will never be anything other than bread and wine. But in partaking of this bread and wine, we also participate in a greater tradition that commemorates the Last Supper. One might ask, what is the position of the Apostolic Johannite Church regarding the Eucharist here? And I think we would simply have to stop on the level of the real presence. I think that for the most part, theologically, we talk about the Eucharist in terms of transubstantiation, but I don't think that that is the only way that we can understand this process. That all of these are valid interpretations of what's going on in the Eucharist. One thing that has been a point of pointless debate, a matter that doesn't matter, is the moment at which the bread and wine become the body and blood of God. Within the Catholic tradition, it's very, very precise. With the words of the institution, it happens. That's it. On one side of the words of institution, it's bread and wine. On the other side, it's body and blood. And that's it. There is this one specific moment where the transformation takes place. Very precise. Within the Orthodox tradition, it is not the words of institution, but rather the epiklesis, the invocation of the Holy Spirit during the anaphora. That is the process by which the body and blood are made from the bread and wine. But you can't point to any particular word or particular set of words whereby there is this transformation. We know that on one side of the invocation of the Holy Spirit, it's bread and wine. On the other side, it's body and blood. And where exactly it happens is a little less clear. And we can even begin to expand this and say that, well, during the process of the Mass, during the process of the liturgy, there is this transformation that takes place. And what we begin to get into here is what is philosophically referred to as the Sorites problem, or the heap problem. I should jot that down here. The Sorites problem, or the heap problem. The word Sorites in Greek simply means a heap. You take a pebble and you put it on the ground. That's not a heap of pebbles, it's just a pebble. You put 2 pebbles on the ground, is that a heap? No. You put 3 pebbles, is that a heap? No, it's 3 pebbles. At what point do you add 1 more pebble and it suddenly becomes a heap? It wasn't a heap before. You take one pebble away, oh, no, that's not a heap anymore. You put the 1 pebble on, now it's a heap. Another way of thinking about it is a man with 3 hairs on his head bald? I think most of us would agree. If you've got 3 hairs, if you look like Charlie Brown, you've got 3 little things on your head, then you're not bald. Then you are bald, rather. Okay. So if you have 4, are you still bald? If you have 5, at what point do you have a certain number of hairs where you're suddenly not bald?
When does dawn become day? When does dusk become night?
Yeah, when we know that we look outside and, it's daylight. At midnight we'll look and say, it's nighttime. At what point do we have dusk become night? You can't point to a specific moment. We know that on one side it's one thing, we know that on the other side it's another thing, but we can't say exactly where it happens. And this is a problem enough that I think we have to simply leave it as an open question in our own liturgical practice as to when this takes place, when this transformation takes place. I think we simply have to say that it does. On a completely tangential note, this has become a matter in the Orthodox and Catholic churches of some importance only when the celebrant drops dead in the middle of Mass. Because you have to figure out whether what the thing that's sitting on the altar is bread and wine or the body and blood of God, because you treat them differently depending on that. So in some sense, that's the only time when it really matters.
Is there any harm in treating bread and wine like body and blood?
I think that there is a risk of cherishing material things.
A certain amount of idolatry.
I think there is a concern for idolatry. I think, though, as long as the intention is pure, for example, I'm saying Mass, I drop dead. You gather up the bread and wine after the applause dies down. You gather up the bread and wine from the altar, and you dispose of them as you would the consecrated species. I don't think that there's any problem that would arise from that. Emily?
Would there be any harm in, setting them aside as one does with extra and then using those in a later Eucharist? Because if it's already the body and blood, then it's still body and blood when it's served, and if it's bread and wine, then it becomes body and blood.
Yeah, I think again we run another risk there, and this is why this is a problem of reconsecrating what has already been consecrated, which seems to imply that somehow there was a flaw in the original consecration. So,
well, you dropped dead.
Yeah. So I think that in practice, it's really not a problem. As a how many angels can dance on the head of a pin kind of question, we could spend the next 6 hours, talking about it without any trouble at all.
3.
I'm sorry?
3.
3 hours? Just 3
No,
hours?
3 angels on the
Oh,
head.
3 angels on the head of a
Good to
pin.
know. Thank you for the trash of that.
Good to know.
Yeah.
Not on the metric ones.
No.
The metric pins are
Yeah.
slightly
Oh,
larger.
the metric angels.
Metric
Right, there you
angels.
go. So slightly larger angels. That works out.
Now, the Eucharist, although it is normally seen as a uniquely Christian practice, it certainly has pre-Christian roots. And there are really 2 specifically that I want to mention. The first is the pagan theoxania, the God-eating. That's any practice where you take something that is, as Crowley has said, a common substance that's elevated to the status of the divine and consumed. Mythologically, it has specific import to the worship of Dionysus, who is, of course, rent apart. Adonis also is rent apart. Any of these gods that get shredded are often also consumed. So the consumption of the flesh of God is what happens in the theoxania. But there's also the Hebrew precursors, specifically the manna and the eating of the manna in the desert, the reception of the bread that is the bread of heaven, the Last Supper, the Passover feast, obviously, but also, and this is one of my personal favorites, is the sacrifice that's made by Melchizedek in chapter 14 of Genesis, where we see somebody who is identified as a priest of the Most High God, of Elyon, and he offers bread and wine as sacrifice. And this is really striking within the context of Hebrew practice, which was you made blood sacrifice. And what was appropriate sacrifice was not bread and wine. And Cain himself, if I remember correctly, is condemned for not offering a blood sacrifice. And yet Melchizedek is able to offer bread and wine as appropriate sacrifice to the Most High God. So when we look back at that priesthood, when we look back at the priesthood of Melchizedek and the offering, the sacrifice of bread and wine, we see a link between the Christian practice and a much older tradition, which is why even in the ordination of priests within our tradition, we say, "Thou art a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek." That is maintained. Because that priesthood is not contained exclusively within the Christian tradition, but extends far beyond it. Not just, our tradition doesn't extend just as far back as Christ, not just as far back as John the Baptist, but extends into the misty dawns of time. Isn't it?
Bless you.
So what does this mean for us as Gnostics, as Johannites, in many cases as esotericists? Certainly, from a Gnostic perspective, what is commemorated in the Eucharist is our taking into ourselves that which is already God, just as we ourselves are already God. But it also points to the relationship between spirit and matter. And it's very easy to caricature Gnosticism as dualist, as having this rigid divide between spirit on the one hand and matter on the other, and matter is bad and spirit is good, and the material world is the work of the demiurge and the spiritual world is the work of the first father. All this kind of rigid dualism. But what we see in the Eucharist is that matter and spirit aren't easily separable. They bleed into one another. It may even be that they're really simply a continuum. Otherwise, we would not be able to transform one into the other. When we look at the world of physics, of contemporary physics, we know that matter and energy can be transformed one into the other. You can take a gram of uranium-235 and turn it into energy and level a city. You can take energy and you can transform it into matter. And that they're not separate things. And I think that there's a parallel, maybe not a perfect parallel, but at least a degree of similarity between this process and the relationship between spirit and matter, where we are able to take that which is matter and transform it into our spiritual food. What I love about the celebration of the Eucharist is precisely its everydayness, that we are taking perfectly ordinary stuff and we transform it into the highest of the high, because that's exactly what we do in our church. We take ordinary stuff ourselves and we transform it into the Most High. We transform it into that which is of the greatest spiritual significance. And that's precisely what we see happening in the Eucharist, is this perfectly ordinary, perfectly everyday process, having a meal, elevated to spiritual significance. My favorite part of the entire Mass, and people always laugh at me when I tell them this, happens right after the Eucharist, when the vessels are cleaned. You're doing the dishes. You're taking the act of doing the dishes and elevating it into something that is spiritually significant. I had the honor and privilege about a month and a half ago of doing First Communion for the sons of a dear friend of mine. And as I was saying the Mass, I was making comments to them. I was pointing out the significance of certain aspects. And I said, as I was cleaning the vessels, I said, this is doing the dishes. This is taking that completely ordinary act and making it significant. And she, of course, turned to her boys and said, look, see, even the bishop does his own dishes. But this act of taking what is everyday, what is ordinary, and making it extraordinary is at the heart of what we do as Gnostics. There is nonetheless a polarity that is involved here. There is nonetheless a recognition of these dualisms. That we have on the one hand matter and spirit, we have bread and we have wine, that we acknowledge that it is through these dualisms, through these dichotomies, that we come to spiritual awareness. And spiritual awareness is not something that comes on high, but rather it comes through our everyday practices. It comes through our experiences of the material world. From a Gnostic perspective, the priest is the one who knows. Not in the sense that he knows the magic formula that turned bread and wine into the body and blood of God, but rather that he knows that the bread and wine are already God. And it's that knowledge that separates the priest, the celebrant, the Gnostic from the profane. We take that which is already God and recognize its divinity. In much the same way as we ourselves look into the mirror and recognize what has already always been there. There are other esoteric traditions that can tell us something about the Eucharist. And I just want to touch on a couple of them very, very briefly. The first is the practice of ceremonial magic, in which the bread and wine represent our elemental passives. They represent water and earth, according to one reading. One could also look at them and see them as the absolute polarities of solidification and rarefaction, in which the wine, the blood, represents fire. and the host represents earth. So there is an elemental commingling that is going on here. There are various forms of Eucharists that are described within the ceremonial tradition. Not simply the Eucharist of 2 elements, which is the most common, but a Eucharist of 3 elements, where the 3 elements pertain to sulfur, mercury, and salt. A Eucharist of 4 elements, in which they pertain to the traditional elements. A Eucharist of 5 elements, in which they pertain to the 4 elements plus spirit. A Eucharist of 6 elements, a Eucharist of 7 elements, a Eucharist of, and you can do a Eucharist in as many forms as you wish. Crowley, again, describes the highest Eucharist as that of a single element. And to a certain extent, we also partake of this tradition in that the reception of one species is sufficient. That to take, for example, to receive the host is to receive the whole of the body and the blood of God. That this really is a single element. The last ceremonial tradition that I want to touch on very briefly is that of František Bardon, the great Czech magus of the 20th century, who describes in his Weg zum Wahren Adepten, which is translated into English as Initiation into Hermetics, of impregnating our food with a desire or wish. That through a process of imagination and mental focus, we impregnate our food with what we desire so that when we consume it, that becomes manifest in us. And I think that one can do the same sort of things in the process of the Eucharist, that within the appropriate, the bounds of appropriateness, one impregnates the Eucharist with our highest desires. And through the consumption of this, we make it manifest. Another esoteric tradition that I think speaks to the Eucharist is, of course, that of alchemy, where we have a transmutation that takes place. And when we look at the Catholic and Orthodox theology of transubstantiation, this is an alchemical transmutation. It is taking what is lowest, taking the lead, taking the dross, and turning it into the highest, turning it into the gold. It is the alchemical transformation. It is the alchemical transmutation. And within the process of our consumption of it, we replicate another important alchemical process, that of the circulation. Because what we do here is a kind of circle. We, who are matter but also spirit, approach that which is matter but also spirit, so that we might take it into ourselves to recognize our own divinity through the process of our own materiality. There is a kind of whirling of these two poles. Similarly, the body and blood are in the process of the Eucharist separated and recombined, solve et coagula. Body and blood are not two separate things. When they are, there's something wrong with the body. When the body bleeds, when the blood becomes separate from the body, that's a sign that something is wrong. Naturally, the body and the blood are of a single piece, but we separate them. We have the body, we have the blood, so that we can remingle them, so that we can return them and elevate them. And it is this alchemical process of separation and recombination that is at the heart of the transformative process in alchemy. It is, you take a substance, and by dividing it, you break it into two parts, and when you recombine it, you don't just return to the original source. You don't just have the same thing, but you suddenly have something that's greater than when you began. By separating and recombining, you elevate it. You, to use Jean de Bouilly's terminology, you increase its vibratory level. So for example, there's a whole school of alchemy that does nothing but use water. And you take water and you separate, it's called the first archeus of the water. You take water and through a process of distillation, you break it into 12 separate waters. So you've got the water of the sulfur of the fire. It's the first one that comes over. And the next is the water of the mercury of the fire. And the water of the salt of the fire. So you've got sulfur, mercury, and salt in fire. And then you get sulfur, mercury, and salt in water. Sulfur, mercury, and salt in air. Sulfur, mercury, and salt in earth. And then you take those 12 and you recombine them so that you put the sulfur, the mercury, and the salt together. So now you've taken, I can actually diagram this. So you take your water and you separate it into 12 separate parts. So the first that comes over is fire. You've got sulfur, mercury, and salt. We've got the same for air, for water, for earth. And then by combining these, what you end up with is simply the sulfur, mercury, and salt of the water. And then you recombine those. Well, chemically, what do you have when you've taken them apart and mixed them all together? The exact same thing you had when you started. But from an alchemical perspective, you've raised the vibratory level of that water. That is now something that is fundamentally different from what you started with. The same thing happens with the body and blood. We take what belongs together, we separate it, and when we reunify it in ourselves, we raise its vibratory level. And the last tradition, which I include only, or at least primarily for my own amusement, is that of Clement de Saint-Marc. Clement de Saint-Marc had a wonderful, wonderful theory of the Eucharist, in which it was completely linked to spermatophagia, semen eating. The whole of the Eucharist was reducible to eating sperm for him. And he claimed that this was the true secret of Catholic practice, that this is what the Eucharist was. Now, if you read his little document on the Eucharist, it's almost laughable. And yet, he's hit on something here. He's not totally wrong in that what we consume when we celebrate the Eucharist is the source of life, is the seed, is that which is meant to be planted within us and grow so that we might be transformed just as the bread and wine are transformed. When we look at the practice of the Eucharist, we take what is everyday and we raise it to the level of the divine. And we put that within ourselves so that we too, who are everyday, who are ordinary, might also be raised to the level of the divine. And so I think that it is fitting that as Johannites, as Gnostics, as Christians, we retain the centrality of the Eucharistic tradition, and that we celebrate the Eucharist in all of its richness and all of its meanings and all of its manifold resonances so that it can have meaning and power for us. I want to open it up to any questions you have at this point that can touch on any of the aspects or anything else. Yes?
In Proverbs starting in 9:1, Wisdom's Invitation, there is the preparation of the mixing of the wine and bread as wisdom's meal.
Mhm.
Is that ever used as part of the explanation of the Eucharist?
I haven't seen it. The only person that I've seen that touches on it, and when I started to prepare this, as so often is the case, I had not done as thorough a search of the secondary literature as I should have. And I found a wonderful essay, and I can't find it again, that covers pretty much everything that I covered and better and more. And that's the only time that I've seen that referenced, is the one time. I don't think that it enters into the broader sort of conversation about the meaning of the Eucharist. Why? I can't really say. It seems obvious to me.
Yeah.
You know, but it took somebody else pointing it out to me for me to see the obvious of it. Joe?
I know the Orthodox, they don't have anything like an adoration or a benediction of the Eucharist. They state that the Eucharist is for eating,
Mhm.
and then Catholics obviously do with their
There's monstrances. There's a veneration of there are Eucharistic miracles, and yeah.
Do we have veneration of the Eucharist as a Johannite tradition? I was trying to find it when the Triduum was happening, because people were asking me, like, how do you celebrate your Triduum? And I was like, why not? We do it as Catholics, but I don't really know.
Yeah, I certainly don't think that there would be any problem in an adoration of the. I'm looking to Sean because he's my boss, but.
Well, I don't see anything. Me personally, it's not something I'd be likely to do.
But I don't think it's problematic.
Whenever I've encountered the sacrament in that form, of course, I give it respect and reverence. But it's not something that I go out of my way myself to do. But others might be.
Yeah, I don't think it's something that we would exclude as a practice. It's certainly not something that's mandated either, even during the practice of Triduum. I see no reason why not to do it. I mean, we do take very, very seriously the idea of the real presence of the divine under the form of this material thing, and we do treat it with reverence. It is treated with as much reverence as it is in any other tradition. So I don't think it's problematic, but it's not certainly not a unique part of our practice. So
Maybe you touched on this and I spaced out. You mentioned in passing about the dead and resurrected gods that are torn apart and then consumed,
Mhm.
and then went into talking about the order of Melchizedek. What is the comparison and contrast between the two? I mean, on the surface, they seem to almost be the opposite.
yeah, they're very, very different,
Yeah.
different kinds of structures. I mean, on the one hand, we have theophagia, or theoxania. This is a pagan practice of the consumption of the god, which seems very, very different from the eating of manna from heaven, the Passover meal. That include the Last Supper and that Passover meal, or the sacrifice of Melchizedek.
All of which seem to have different emphasis.
I think there are different emphases and there are different resonances, which is why the Eucharist for us is never univocal. It always has these multiple resonances, as any good mythological structure does. It always has multiple levels of meaning. So I think that all of these can be at play, and all of these are commemorated in our practice of the Eucharist. Father Tim.
When you said you talked about dying and rising gods, obviously Osiris came to mind.
Yeah.
Then later when you talked about separating and separating the body and the blood and then recombining.
Yeah.
My head went to embalming practice, and so I thought I'd combine those into one question.
Is there I mean, clearly you know more of this than I do. I mean, I know the basic, it's the Memphite recension, where Osiris is separated into the 12 or 13 parts. Oh, where have I heard that number before? And then reunited. Certainly there is an alchemical symbolism there. I don't know if there is a theophagic tradition within Egyptian practice.
Not that I've heard, but let's look around the room, just in case.
Yeah, I don't recall ever having encountered that. The flip side is that certainly Osiris is a fertility god and is associated with foodstuffs in that regard, and so it would make sense to me that if one were, for example, to give thanksgiving for one's meal within a Kemetic tradition, the person you'd give thanks to would be Osiris.
But there was the notion that the fish, the one part that they couldn't find was his phallus.
Yeah.
The fish consumed the phallus,
Crabs.
and I believe that, or was it
crabs.
Oh.
Crabs.
That may have
Really?
thrown me completely off because I thought it was a fish, and hence.
Yeah, I had
had
always
to, under certain circumstances.
heard it that way as
consume it.
well.
I heard it crabs.
Okay.
So yeah.
But which seems to be the
Seafaring.
opposite of
Yeah.
theophagy.
We go from
actually.
fish to John, and then, it's all...
Yeah, I mean, you can make these jumps, but I think that certainly in terms of the alchemical process of separation and recombination, I think that's absolutely there.
Yeah.
If it helps to...
The same is true of Dionysus.
So
These recombined.
To stick just to the Christian myth, the sword pierces Christ's side, the
Blood
and the water
and
run
water.
out, and they're presumably recombined in the resurrected body, which is clearly at a higher energetic level
Yeah.
than the physical body.
I mean, we could even I think bring in the Grail legend here, that it is the blood and the water that spill forth from the side of Christ when he's pierced by the spear of Longinus is captured in the Grail, in the San Grail. So, I mean, there are 1,000 more streams that are going to flow into this, but I think you're absolutely right.
I was going to say that I found out, interestingly, through Father Jordan, that there is I forget the exact name of the place, but essentially they're called like the Kemetic Society or something. They're like a old-time fundamentalist practicing Egyptian faith.
Reconstructionist Egyptian practice.
Egyptian practice, and their main church is in Chicago. And I'm gonna be assuming I can. They have public ritual. I'm gonna be going down and attending, and apparently they're, from what I've heard from people who do know them, they're really nice. And I can find out for you if you'd like. Yeah.
I mean, we should see if there is. I mean, that would be just one more piece to add to the richness of this practice.
The fabulous polysemy that is the Eucharist.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Joe?
Can you discuss, from the best of your knowledge, or maybe what you've read, about the intelligence that's required for the Eucharist, as in the form? Like baptism requires water, which is naturally made. Oil is naturally made for chrism, and contrition kind of is naturally made. But the bread and the wine are something that requires a human intelligence in order to...
Yeah, I mean, there is something here. It's the distinction that the Greeks were very, very fond of between techne and physis.
What was that word?
Techne and physis.
What is this?
Obviously, the root of our word physical, the roots of our word technical. These are natural objects. Phuse onta are things that grow up of their own accord. Water. I think you could even claim, oils, seeping from a plant. Techne onta, on the other hand, are things that are made, that are the product of artifice, that are the product of intelligence. And we even make reference to that in certain forms of our liturgy when we say that this is the work of human hands. And what does that mean? It means it's a techne onta.
But when we do that, we always give credit to the physics as well.
Right.
Because we
Right.
say fruit of the vine and work of human
hands,
or,
right.
or from the earth.
Yeah.
Fruit of
Grain
the earth.
of the earth.
Yeah. So I think that it is important to recognize the technical element here, though, as well. I think that's an interesting insight. How it plays out, I'm not 100% sure. I think that it points to, and this is really, really, really shooting from the hip, so I could go wildly astray here. I think it does point to the office of the sacrificial priest, that there is a human practice that intervenes here in a profound sort of way. Moses is fished out of the river. His baptism is a purely natural act. The offering of sacrifice, that's never a natural act. That's always a volitional act. That is always a willed act. And so I think that there might be some sense in which the practice of the Eucharist points to this office in the fact that it makes use of technical products.
Could you say that it's kind of a little bit like naturalis interruptus in a way that it kind of reverts, we're not flowing with nature anymore. We're kind of working not with it but yet against it as well in order to elevate above it.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's a tendency among certain schools, certain Luddite schools of thought to say sort of any technical intervention in nature is in opposition to nature. I think we can take a somewhat more sophisticated view and say that there are kinds of technical intervention that are in keeping with nature, and there are kinds of technical interventions that are in opposition to nature. And I think when we look around at what the Benedictine sisters have done here, I think we're very much talking about a technical intervention that's very much in keeping with nature. We've got the solar panels on the roof, we've got the geothermal pumps in the basement, that we're making use of nature. We're harnessing nature, but we're not seeking to dominate nature. And I don't see that domination at play here. So perhaps it is pointing us to this appropriate kind of harnessing of nature, this appropriate participation with nature, where we're still intervening. There's still our cultivation, but at the same time we can do that in keeping with the essence of the natural object. That we don't do violence to nature when we make bread.
Like solar panel versus atomic bomb?
I think that's exactly it, or even the great example of a system of energetic creation that's in keeping with nature is the water wheel. That it lifts up the energy from the river, but allows the river to keep flowing. The solar panel doesn't block out the sun. It receives it and makes use of it, but also lets it be what it is. So, Stephanie, I think this is going to be our last question.
Okay. Well, it was actually a statement that's going to be something I was realizing while I was in discussions that I've had with Scott, is that out of every single living thing on this planet, we're the only ones, we as human beings, the only ones to raise things to the level of the psychic. And what occurred to me is that the Eucharist is us doing that very act, which is reflective of everything.
Very consciously.
Yeah, very consciously. Taking the bread and the wine and raise it, and through human intervention, the fruit of the vine and the act of human hands blended together to raise it to the psychic level, which is what we're doing when we use the solar panels to work with the sun, or the water will work with the water.
I mean, certainly a plant makes use of the light to make its food, but not in the same way that we store up energy from, and we make use of that energy in a myriad number of ways.
Right.
I think that there is something about that. I think if we use this threefold distinction of the Heilig,
Psychic and
the highlight, the psychic and pneumatic,
Mm-hmm.
we are taking, that's precisely what's going on here. We are taking something that's pure hyle. It's pure matter.
Right.
It's the most basic stuff, especially
Yeah.
if we use, Father Scott's leaden hosts, which you can use as a weapon if you need to.
He doesn't breakfast cereal.
The breakfast cereal, pour them over milk,
From Dominican.
Jizos or something like that. But Nazaros. But we are raising it from that most basic material level and raising it to a spiritual level. But I think that the most important thing to recognize there is if they were not already of a single substance, we couldn't do that.
Right.
You can never take something that is fundamentally one thing and turn it into something that's fundamentally different.
Mm-hmm.
They have to already participate in the same nature in the first place in order to transform one into the other. So when we look at ourselves, why is it that we are able to reach spiritual heights? Because we are already of a single substance with God.
Right. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.